Now, this teaching is really important to understand the work of an apostle and where the limits of their authority start and where the authority ends. Now, let's start with the word authority, if you will. The word authority, in some people's mind, is a bad word. Literally, I meet a lot of people who, boy, when you talk about authority in the church, they get all bent out of shape. You know, they just feel like there should be no authority in the church. And you know, my response to them is, would you take your 6-year-old to a soccer league that had no coaches, that had no structure, no teams, just 200 kids went on the field and they threw a soccer ball in the middle of it and said, there you go, play? Of course not. If your 6-year-old son or daughter, grandson or granddaughter was going to play in a soccer league, wouldn't it make you feel good if there were teams and coaches, rules to follow, a schedule? So what are you asking for? You're asking for authority. My question is, why do we want authority for a 6-year-old soccer league and not the Church of Jesus Christ? It makes no sense. If you're going to accomplish anything, I mean, you can't even put together a choir or a missions trip or accomplish any type of building project with a group of people without leadership, without understanding what authority is. The reason why people are afraid of the word authority is because they've seen it abused. And I've been all over the world where people in authority have abused their followers. The people in authority in the church, unfortunately, have acted like the world's authority. They've become despotic, dictatorial. They've become mean and arrogant and self-centered and egotistical, narcissistic. Their whole leadership style is really sickening. You know, they're angry with people if they don't cater to them and do exactly as they say. And there is no room for leadership in the kingdom without the fruit of the Spirit. There's no room for leadership in the kingdom of God or the church without the attitude of Jesus when he put the towel around himself and took a bowl and washed his disciples' feet. All leadership in the church should be executed for the benefit of the followers. No leadership in the church should be executed for the benefit of the leader. Now, having said that, what I believe about that, what I believe apostles how they should conduct themselves worldwide, we still have to have an understanding of the word authority. We still need to back up, take a breath, and understand that authority is not a bad word. It is a needed concept in the church. But I'm going to give you another word that I believe is a synonym of authority. And so anytime we say or hear the word authority, I'm going to ask you to hear this word. Authority is responsibility. That's all that means. He who is in authority has the most responsibility. He who has the most responsibility has the fewer rights. Get that, okay? He who is in authority has greater responsibility. He who has greater responsibility has fewer rights. I tell people all the time, welcome to leadership. You have given up most of your rights in the church. You no longer have the right to talk and gossip. You no longer have the right to just run your mouth and do what you want. No longer do you have the right to miss services just because you're tired. No longer do you have the right just to stay home and not go to meetings because you don't feel like it or because your favorite TV show is on. That's what we've made out of it. Authority doesn't mean more rights. Authority means less rights. Okay? So you got that? Authority means responsibility. Responsibility means fewer rights. Now this is about spheres. This chapter is about spheres. A sphere is a circle. A sphere is a circle. If you look in your book, on page 60, I quote 2 Corinthians 10:13. And this is Paul talking about his apostolic sphere. And it says, "We, however, will not boast beyond measure, but within the limits of our sphere, which God has appointed us. A sphere which especially includes you." Now, there's some assumptions from this passage that are really important. is that, number one, apostles have spheres. And here's what I mean. Within this circle, as an apostle, you have responsibility. Okay? You have responsibility. But the moment you go outside of this sphere, you don't. You do not have responsibility. Authority. When I say responsibility, I'm equating authority and responsibility together. So you no longer have authority, which means that you may have authority in a local church, but when you go preach outside of that local church, you don't operate in the same authority. You may have authority in apostle over a region, but when you go into other people's regions, you don't have that authority. You may be an apostle in a particular nation with great authority. When you go outside of your nation and you're an invited guest, you do not carry the same authority unless that guest has given it to you. You do not assume that your authority exists outside of your sphere. So in this verse, 2 Corinthians 10:13, Paul is saying that apostles have spheres. It says in this verse that God has appointed. So God is the one that sets these spheres, not man, but God has appointed people these spheres. And then Paul says that his sphere included the Corinthians. And the reason that the Corinthians were in his sphere is because he had planted that church and still maintained an apostolic connection and an apostolic covering of that church. So that church and those people were in his sphere. But Paul also knew that there are other churches and other people that are not in his sphere. We need to know the limits of our sphere. Now, I did another diagram in the book, and I want you to turn to it. I'm not going to take time to draw it on the board, but you can see it on page 63. Notice that this circle that I drew, sphere of responsibility, is in the very center of this particular diagram that I'm using right here. That's your sphere of responsibility. This is your calling. This is where you spend 90% of your time. This is the right thing to stay within the sphere. There is an outer sphere called your sphere of influence. Now, I have responsibility within my sphere. Outside of my sphere of responsibility, I may have some influence, but I don't have authority. I can influence this sphere, but I don't have authority to govern it. And so we need to discern when we have moved from responsibility to influence. The sphere of influence will cause you control. In other words, people, I think, step out of their sphere. Let's say a father has a sphere of authority in his family, and then he tries to go to his neighbor's house and discipline his children. He'll have to develop control in a carnal way in order to be able to achieve that, because he's trying to use authority in his sphere of influence, and it doesn't work. You should only spend 10% of your time in your sphere of influence. If your sphere of responsibility is the right thing, the sphere of influence is a good thing. It's not necessarily the right thing. It is a good thing, but only about 10% of the time. The final sphere out there is called the sphere of concern. A lot of people make the mistake that if they're concerned about it, then they're anointed to solve it. There are many things in the world, and most of them that you're concerned about, you are not authorized to do anything about. You might be able to help, you might be able to send someone, but as far as saying you have governmental authority by God to step into that sphere, you're going to get yourself in trouble. You need to remember what Paul said, that apostles have spheres. They're set by God. There are limits to that authority. They include some people and not others, some places and not others, some issues and not others. But that sphere of concern will cause you frustration if you work in it. You should spend 0% of your energy there, and it is not just the right thing or good thing, it's usually the wrong thing. And so that's a little teaching and a small little chapter on spheres. We probably could say a lot more, but we need to move into chapter 10. And so at this time, read chapter 10, do the workbook, and then watch the next video.